Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome once again to our RSM In Conversations. And can I take this opportunity to thank you all for the feedback that you give us after each of these sessions. And we do read them. And I noticed that one of the comments that's sometimes made about me, how dare they, is that I sometimes talk too much. So let's get straight into the action for tonight then. So my guest today is very straightforward and easy to introduce. It's the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury and Primate of all England, or Justin, as he's insisted that I call him from the start. So Justin, welcome very much and really good to see you.
It's great to see you.
So now then, we usually start these off with something about COVID because it's the story of the year and absolutely everybody has something to say on this, and I think people will be very interested in what you have to say on this. But I want to introduce it from by virtue to your book, and people also say that I promote everyone's books, but we should do that because you're doing this for nothing. So if you can get some more royalties, good luck for you. So you wrote this book, Reimagining Britain, and you wrote it in 2018, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, it was before COVID anyway. And
yeah.
in chapter 4, which is called Health and Healing Our Brokenness, you go on to talk about how our healthcare system has been fragmented or fractured, and this is before COVID. And in particular, I want to kick off with one of the examples you use. Again, you clearly have the gift of prophecy. I suppose you would have to in your job, but anyway. You say one of the things that is most broke was public health. And you go into the story of John Snow, who of course we all know very well, but you also introduce the Reverend Henry Whitehead, who I have to be honest with you and say I had not heard of, and I'm supposed to be an epidemiologist. And so let's start off with that. And really, if you could just talk about what do you think was broke in our public health system? And then I'll ask you the $64,000 question. Do you think we're on the way to mending it?
I think what was broken when I wrote the book, and sounds like advertising, it probably is, but there's a second edition coming out in April. So
excellent.
Don't bother to buy it at the moment, but if you felt like after April, it makes a good doorstop. I think when I wrote it, what seemed to me to be absolutely obvious was that public health was incredibly underfunded. I'd sort of come across this when I was Dean of Liverpool, so running Liverpool Cathedral for 4 years. And I got to know one of the local public health people very well. And they just didn't have the resources for what is clearly the process of stopping people getting ill in the first place. I think part of the problem was at the time it was in a sort of separate silo of its own. It was deeply underfunded. It didn't have that much prestige. And you go back to Whitehead and Snow. Of course, the extraordinary, in those days, it was one of Whitehead's colleagues who said, who was another priest in the slums at the time, and he said, if you really love God, you'll be interested in sewers. Because he saw that any care for the whole person has to include issues of public health. And when we look at what public health could and should include, it is the whole person. It's around mental health. There's all kinds of different areas it affects, which are affected by housing. It overlaps with so much. And no, I don't think it's been mended. It's been under the most astonishing pressure. Since then, we had the Salisbury poisoning, when, of course, public health was in a position they'd never expected to be in. And then we've had COVID, and I think we've yet to see whether the lessons have been learned.
Would you like to amplify a little bit what you think the lessons, when people say the lessons have been learned, they usually have some idea of what those lessons are?
Well, do they? I wouldn't claim to be an expert, particularly talking to a bunch of doctors and epidemiologists. I think one of the key lessons is about giving public health the profile and prestige, because that makes a difference, and the resources, and also, above all, a reach and an ability to reach across different disciplines. There is obviously epidemiology. We've learned that to our cost in the last year. But there are so many other areas. We have 8 million people in the country who are in substandard housing, whose health is poorer than it ought to be. That is a public health concern as well as a housing concern. Public health in schools and public health education, their role in education can be extremely important. Issues around type 2 diabetes. The list is almost endless. Vaccinations, measles, MMR, all this kind of thing, countering the ability to counter conspiracy theories around vaccination and prevention of illness. Yep. If they're doing their job as well as they can, it will reduce pressure on primary care and on the critical care sector.
I mean, obviously, you know that Public Health England has been in the limelight in not always a good way, and there's been a restructuring, which is not uncommon in healthcare systems. But
yes, right.
It's not clear as to, I don't think anyone would deny, and shouldn't deny, obviously the business of PHE is about epidemics, infections, and so on. That's what they're brought on earth to do. But there is more debate and some counter views that they shouldn't really be getting involved in what we might call lifestyle, obesity, or issues like mental health, or some of the, or you mentioned housing. And some critics would say that they should stick to what they should have done properly, which is to protect us against COVID and other epidemics. I'm guessing you're not of that view.
I think, I don't claim to be an expert, but intuitively, instinctively, I would say, no, I'm not of that view. And there's a couple of very clear reasons. As you know much, much better than I do, Simon, that there are very few disciplines in any area, but particularly in medicine at the moment, where everything is done within one narrow area of speciality. That on the whole, it requires teamwork, and it requires cross-disciplinary working. It seems to me public health somehow became isolated from the necessity of being part of what was happening. You look at areas like Toxteth, which I know a little bit, and the housing around there, clearly, issues of public health, and at the time, a few years earlier, when I was working in a town in the Midlands, the rise in TB was a public health issue. And it's not just whoever deals with TB, a chest specialist, I suppose, or I'm not a doctor of any kind, as you can obviously see. That necessity for interdisciplinary working should give areas like public health much more power and much more capacity to convene, because they should, with epidemiological studies, see very quickly where there are significant issues in the area where they're working.
Okay, fair enough. But one area which I think you're being as modest as I thought you would be, and are well known to be, but where you really do have a lot more to say probably than us, is about the impact of COVID on society. And again, there are two narratives there, both of which I think have got something going for them. The one that we've been documenting ourselves in our research is, of course, of division and fracture, and blaming the young, the feckless young, for spreading the virus, etc. And some work we did recently showed that 15% of people in a population study said that it actually had a go at people for misbehaving, and 15% of people said they'd had a go at someone, had got at them in public. And I don't know if you have, but I've seen this happen sometime. And it's pretty horrible, actually. It is. And I saw a horrible instance in our local DIY shop when that was open. So on the one hand, then there is this fracturing, and I think it will only get worse as it goes on. And then, with people, some people turning in on their neighbors, and police stopping a couple walking, around a dam in wherever it was, Derbyshire. Before I come on to the good bit, but I wonder what you feel about when, for whatever reasons, people do not love their neighbours, but call the police about their neighbours.
I think one of the most, for me, it seems to me that one of the most dramatic impacts of COVID has been that it has stripped away the paper with which we'd papered over the cracks in our society. We can go back a very long way, and anyone can argue about how far, but if we take it to the previous great crisis, which was, I would suggest, the great financial crash of 08-09 and the economic crisis and austerity which followed it. If you go back to those, somehow we managed to paper back over that and to ignore both the causes of that and the consequences of that. COVID has stripped that raw. You simply cannot ignore what is happening in our society. And the most dangerous moment in crises, in economic and social crises, is the moment when you begin to come out of them. Historically, very often revolutions have happened not as you went into the crash, but as you came out of it. Some of the classic examples of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and for that matter, perfectly obviously, the rise of power of Hitler in 1933. As the first signs of relief from the Great Depression began to be apparent. I think in our society, and when you have these moments of extreme crisis and tension, initially people are drawn together, and we saw that last year, and we have, if I can put it crudely, 15,000 branches, i.e. parishes, chaplaincies, 20,000 clergy, another X thousand youth workers and other people. We probably, I don't know, employ 35, 40,000 people. And the parishes are the most incredible information network. And the reports all over the place were of an upsurge in community, which has not been evident in this third lockdown to the same degree. And I think what we're seeing is that people are more and more circling the wagons, often using the echo chambers of social media, and whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or whatever. They're circling the wagons to be with people like themselves. There is a capacity to attack people, which I saw last week in the Church of England when a Caribbean British priest tweeted something that he himself apologized for. There's no need to go into the details, but he apologized, he withdrew it, he was very sorry. But the vitriol that went at him and at his bishop was absolutely indescribable. In fact, quite a bit at me for that matter, but that was less, it felt less personal. And there's a capacity for that, because he was Black, that wasn't there previously to express, but reflected a sense of people who feel threatened. We've seen the rise of fundamentalism in every world religion, including Buddhism, in the last 35 or 40 years. And that is a response to change and the extraordinarily rapid technological change. So in our society, I see a number of things that were happening, technology, genetics, capacities in biology, in quantum physics, and so on and so forth, robotics, VR, AI. And as those came along, they increased concerns, and COVID has just been a catalyst of the expression of that and of the fears of people, which lead to people lashing out. Sorry, it's a very long answer. I'll shut up.
No, it's not at all. But on the other hand, of course, as you said at the start of this, there was, again, good evidence for an increase in community spirit, an increase in volunteering, including you yourself and many others. So there was a good side, but I'm not seeing any data on this, but it does feel that has subsided a bit, not least because of the way in which we deal with the pandemic. Is it becomes, as we go into our third lockdown, there's not very much that we can do that's heroic except just sit inside and stay away from people. I mean, that is surely a barrier to community spirit and volunteering.
I think there's still quite a lot we can do. The figures that we have from a polling company that I work with showed they did a study, which was a very, very big study indeed, which the Church of England was involved in together with a huge number of other organisations, which showed that last year, in 2020, there was an increase of about 4.7 million in volunteering. And about 4 million say they intend to continue. That comes from Royal Voluntary Society and the RVS. And that is enormously exciting and encouraging, and is a huge army that is capable of making a very big difference. Whether society as a whole, local government, national government has worked out how to mobilize that goodwill is a different question. And I'm not sure that, for that matter, voluntary organizations, what one of my predecessors, Temple, called the intermediate organizations, the things between the state and the household, I'm not sure that any of us have really worked this out very well. Equally, there is still a lot to be done. We're seeing more and more use of food banks, more and more need for debt support, debt counselling. We're seeing, obviously, bereavement care is necessarily bereavement care is in enormous demand. Particularly as the figures are, if you include all deaths, that over the last year, about 650,000 people would have attended or not been able to attend a curtailed funeral of someone they loved and cared for.
I was about to say you're preaching to the converted on that one, but that would have been completely the wrong thing to say. But you absolutely are, and I think that's almost the worst thing of friends of mine who've had to say goodbye to members of their family, on an iPad in a cold hospital car park. Now, I just want to, it's horrific. Now, folks, I'm going to change the subject, but I'm going to come back because we want to come back to some of the issues you already raised. I'm going to end with COVID at the end and to talk about where we go from there, and going to come back in particular to the issues you mentioned of austerity, economics, and so on. But it's a convention, and I think it's a good convention, to talk a bit about you directly, because you're here and you're definitely interesting. So, right. You are. So now, one of the great resources of our time is Desert Island Discs. It beats anything else. So the first thing I do is go and listen to Desert Island Discs first, and absolutely, definitely do that. So on that, you talked to, let's go back to your early days, etc. And something happened to you that I can identify with, because it happened to my mother as well, which is, in your adult life, you discovered that the person, your father, your legal father, etc., was not in fact your actual father. It was not the person that you'd imagined to be your father. And you've spoken a bit about this. And I don't know if we can just talk about, what that feels like, particularly in the position you are in. And so over to you, as it were.
Well, I think it was about 2016 or 2017.
Yeah, it wasn't long ago.
It wasn't long ago. When Charles Moore, who's a well-known journalist, came to see me, asked to see me, and said that he'd been at dinner somewhere, and the person next to him had said, "Oh, actually, my husband is the real father of the Archbishop of Canterbury," which, as he said, was an unusual line at a party.
Yes.
And so I said, "What rubbish?" And we had, my father was I'll call him my father, the person I grew up with, who I thought was my father, was a complicated man, alcoholic, all kinds of complexities, and his life was not, I discovered more and more, was not at all as he portrayed it. But all that set aside, I did think he was my father. And when Charles said this, I said, "Oh, rubbish, let's do we'll do a DNA test, and that'll prove you're wrong. If you can get DNA for the person who was supposed to be my father." So they did. This is all public knowledge. I'm not breaking confidences. He was a very nice man called Anthony Montague Brown, who had been Winston Churchill's deputy private secretary when my mother was one of the personal secretaries at Number 10 to Winston Churchill in the 50s. Obviously about 9 months before January the 6th, 1956. And they did the DNA, and cut a long story short, I got a text in Holy Week that year, the week before Easter. I was in the middle of a youth club with noise like a volcano going off, and my phone buzzed, and I looked at it, and it said 99.98% chance that Anthony Montague Brown is your real father. And I don't know how your mother felt. I just thought, well, there we are. One of the reasons for that, I'm going to bring some religion into this, and please forgive me, but if you ask an archbishop, you're going to get stuck with a little bit of religion, because I do an awful lot of it, really. I was talking, and he said, well, Charles said, we'll publish this on Saturday week, the week after Easter. And so that's fine. And I sort of rang up my, the General Secretary of the Church of England, who's the sort of permanent secretary, as it were, as in a government department, and said, "William, got a bit of unusual news. You might like to talk to the comms people." And I'll talk to the comms people here. And he also talked to the lawyer, who said, this was quite amusing, who said, "Oh, well, it's not a problem. They changed canon law so you could be a bishop if you were illegitimate back in the 1950s, I think. At least I think they changed canon law. At least I'm almost sure they changed canon law, and was then seen, I think the story is, it may be exaggerated, it was the only time he was ever seen to run, as he went to the library to look up the particular clause, because it wasn't one he was consulted on very often. Very good lawyer, is now retired. But he said to me later, I was thinking, if he wasn't legally, if the Archbishop's not legally a bishop, then no bishop he's consecrated is legally a bishop. No one he's married is legally married. No one who he's baptized is, etc. Yeah. Nobody he's ordained is a real priest, and none of the people they've baptized, etc., etc. You can imagine this went on for this had complex. Yes. Anyhow, he discovered it was legitimate. But the key point was that it was all right, that whether I was, as one of my colleagues said, we always knew you were a complete bastard.
Yes.
It was, someone was bound to say it.
Yes.
The key point was talking to the comms person. Before the news came out for the statement I had to issue, I had to say, I said, well, for me, my key identity is who I am in Jesus Christ. but I can't think what to say in the press statement. And he said, well, you've just said it. So that was the line we took. And for me, that is who I am, is who God knows me to be. Now, that may sound to many people on this call as like saying who the fairy at the bottom of the garden knows me to be, but I'm sorry about that. But that is where I am, and that is a deep sense of my identity is found in God, not principally in DNA.
Perfect answer. I think your press officer was quite correct. I mean, no, my mother did feel that. It was the 1950s, and it was different. And she
Yes.
And she felt that her alleged, who she thought was her father and her mother, who wasn't her mother at all, treated her differently to the rest of the family, and that to her explained why. So it's, you know, times have changed, and thank God they have.
And thank God they have. I could not agree more. I mean, what on earth does it matter?
Yeah. I mean, you do say also, again, from that well-known resource, Desert Island Discs, was that you had a messy childhood. You mentioned already, you know, that your parents both had what we would now call substance misuse problems, whatever you wish to call it. And I think the question I was going to ask was that, if, for example, you now went on Britain's Got Talent, I mean, please don't, whatever you do, but people would say that's a great backstory. You know, that's how it would be interpreted. Yeah. Or alternatively, if you ended up seeing someone like me, I would say, well, you know, it's understandable you have problems because of your childhood. You've half answered it, but I just want to push it a little bit more in the sense that what would you say to people? Would you say you're proof that you look at what's happened to you, that you can overcome difficult childhoods, or would you also say that it shaped you in ways that perhaps make you a better priest?
I'd say both. And I'd say I have the huge, enormous, indescribable blessing of a wonderful marriage. And I think that was one that has been one of the greatest points of healing. I think, you know, it was a pretty messed up. It really was pretty messed up. There were all the normal consequences of substance abuse.
Yeah.
And some of the abnormal ones. And I think marrying someone who was as stable as they come and developing with the normal ups and downs, a marriage where we both accept each other, and I know that I am accepted. The sense of being accepted by God was one of the foundational moments of change. But I would also say the second, that there are fragilities, there's dark sides, there's fragilities in me, of which I'm deeply aware, which probably do make me a better priest, not least because I think I'm not saying this to my credit, but I find it very hard to judge other people, not in the sense, you know, in the unhealthy sense. I don't condemn people easily. I don't hold on to enmities. When people do things to me, I'll get grumpy like everyone, but I'm quite prone to say, well, you know, I can hardly throw stones because I live in a glass house myself.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's move on from that. And I suppose one of the many interesting things about you was at the start, you pursued, in your own words, mammon, and they don't get more mammon-like or whatever the adjectives, and joined the oil industry, which is what you did. And one of your colleagues actually texted me, I'll tell you it later, and said you were actually very, very good at it, and you would have risen to
them. Yes.
Yes, well, they did. So, but obviously you changed, and Andrew Hughes has asked a specific question that obviously, you know, you then go into orders, etc., from 1989. But looking back, what did you gain from the period that you did spend in the House of Mammon, if I can put it that way, which I think I can actually?
I think I gained some fantastic friendships. I worked particularly the second company I worked for, it was just a wonderful place to work. I was mentored by some absolutely wonderful and brilliant people, colleagues and bosses. There was the exposure to, which was healthy for me, to having grown up without much belief, having come to faith at university. There was then the exposure of just living and working in life as a Christian, but with people for whom it was genuinely irrelevant, and having to think about that, the challenges to faith. I think I learned a lot of sort of useful technical stuff. Even churches have budgets, and cash flow and lack of cash flow.
Yes.
And I suppose the biggest thing I learned was thinking strategically from one of my bosses. And he drew that out of me. And that was so not always just look, however big the crisis, and funny enough, it was a time of very low prices in the oil industry, the late 80s. Mm-hmm. However low the price of oil, however tough the financial conditions were for the company, he taught us to keep looking beyond the crisis, not to get mesmerized by what was in front of you, but to keep your eye on where you were trying to go. And that is a really important leadership lesson.
I think that's good. I think that answers Andrew's question very well. So you leave and you go through, you start training 89, and you start your ministry in the Midlands. And again, I've heard from a very good source, I think it's the same source actually, that you start in Nuneaton, and my friend tells me that one of your first things, you sorted out a gang war in Nuneaton. Is that true?
Yeah, it's a bit of an exaggeration. I'd love to
say.
Okay.
I'll tell you afterwards. Okay, yeah.
I managed to start a youth project, and there were a number of different gangs around, and we managed to get some of them, but it was mainly the youth worker, not me. In fact, very largely the youth worker we managed to get things to work a bit better. Gang war sounds a bit dramatic. There was a certain amount of gang rivalry between different drug groups and other stuff at the time. And this bloke, who was a local man, who's now an NHS chaplain, actually, who was the youth worker, sort of taught me a lot about how to work with these groups.
Okay, well, I think that is true then, yeah. And obviously you go through the hierarchy, all sorts of jobs, but we're going to jump forward to the job that people are going to be obviously interested in when you become the 105th Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, the only thing I know about how that happens is from Yes Minister, which I know you like actually.
Yes, I do. I love it.
You told me, and the bit I thought, just a bit to see where you are is I think you define yourself as a modernist, but Humphrey says that's a code for someone who doesn't believe in God. And then Jim Hackett. Yeah. But I'm sure that doesn't apply to you.
No, it really, really, really doesn't. What would be the point of leaving the oil industry?
Yeah.
And doing all this, which is much more stressful and not as well paid, if you didn't really believe in God, I just can't see any reason to do it.
I think Sir Humphrey tells Jim that actually he said it's not required, but it's an optional extra. Anyway, so you're number 105. So let me ask you a question, and I'm really praying I get the right answer here. But of the 105 archbishops, 104 because you can't count yourself, who'd be your favourite? Let's stick to modern times. Who's your favourite?
Well, modern times, William Temple. Do you win?
Sorry. Yeah, I do. I can prove it because I know William Temple, 1942 to 44. I'm reading it. I put that down and said, I'm buggered if he says something else.
Well, there you are.
Okay,
you're right.
I know. Tell me
word
why.
is intact. He was funny enough, he's the only father-son combination. His father was Freddie Temple, was Archbishop from about 1899 to 1905 or something like that. And William Temple was a great scholar, but he was the most, he was Archbishop of York for about 13 years before he was in Canterbury, and Bishop of Manchester before that. And he died of a heart condition tragically early in his late 50s, early 60s. And he was a man of enormous compassion, great insight, and particularly enormous passion for social justice, combined with a huge love of Christ and love of God, which drew people into faith. He was a man of integrity, hard work, just an extraordinary and remarkable human being.
I thought you might choose Temple because of also his politics, and they were politics. He definitely was political. And his association with some of the great thinkers of the day. And tell me a little bit about this, just because I think just to explore that a little bit with you, and its relevance to you as well.
Well, his politics were left-wing. He was a passionate supporter of Christian socialism. But remember, this was in the North during the Great Depression. And politics was very different then. I'm much more apolitical, really. I mean, everyone thinks I'm on the other side, from whichever they happen to mention at any time, which is quite successful. But he wasn't a political Christian. He was a politically intelligent archbishop. He wrote an absolutely superb book, much better than mine, called Christianity and Social Order, in the late 1930s, about the kind of society we should have. And in there you see influence of both left and right. There's quite a lot of Hegel and a little bit of Marx, but quite a lot of Hegel and Hegelian dialectic. But underlying it all is a very profound and deep spirituality. And that combination I find absolutely inspiring, and his willingness to stick his head above the parapet.
Did he pay, my understanding was that he didn't really, but did he pay any price for that?
Yes, he did. He paid a price in unpopularity with, attacks from the media, unpopularity from more conservative people, and from more left-wing people from outside the Christian socialist tradition. The sort of more Marxist atheist groups who felt that this was just opiate of the masses and all that. But he did pay a price. But people knew he loved them, and that really made a difference.
So we're drifting a little bit into the political sphere, and I think that's important. And you began by mentioning some of austerity, and indeed, this series, when we used to do it live at the RSM, God knows when that was, a long time ago. One of our first guests was Ken Loach, and we showed the audience the food bank scene from I, Daniel Blake. And it didn't take Jeremy Paxman to work out that Ken was no fan of austerity. And I don't think it takes Jeremy Paxman to work out that you're not either. Can I just quote you what you write? It's just 2 lines, but I think it's beautiful. Austerity is the word that almost invariably conceals the crushing of the weak, the unlucky, the ill, and a million others. Austerity is a theory for the rich, but it's a reality of suffering for the poor. That's you from your first. I'm sure that will be in the second edition.
Yeah.
Expand a bit.
I think this is why I'm so keen on the concept of reimagining Britain. after 2008-9, there was a choice. We always have a choice as to who was going to pay for this crash. And if you make a decision, you have to make a conscious decision for it not to be paid for by the most vulnerable, because by definition, they're the most vulnerable. And the only way you make that decision is, it seems to me, certainly within the Christian tradition and the Christian heritage we have, is saying that those with the broadest shoulders pay the price. I'm always influenced by the Psalms, by the Old Testament prophets, particularly Isaiah, by the Gospels, where Jesus in the Beatitudes in Luke, in the Lucan form, makes it very clear that and Luke is the gospel of bringing in the outsider. It's the gospel for the poor and the vulnerable. And Luke says, Jesus says in Luke's gospel, for instance, blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Woe to you rich, for you have had your reward already. In the Magnificat, which is the Song of Mary, which comes in the Christmas stories, and which is sung every evening prayer in the standard Church of England prayer book. I mean, we used it this evening just before I came on this. In the Magnificat, it says, Mary gives praise to God, and she says, you've thrown down from the mighty from their seat and lifted up the poor and weak, and so on and so forth. You go back to the Old Testament, and you have verses like, let justice roll down like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Just the most beautiful and powerful couplet. Inequality is condemned from beginning, or injustice is condemned from beginning to end in the Bible and in the Jewish tradition, in the Christian tradition. Wealth is not condemned, but irresponsible and unshared wealth is condemned. In the book of Ruth, one of the most beautiful books in the Bible, you have the story there of a refugee woman from an enemy nation settling in Bethlehem with her mother-in-law, who came from there as a widow, and her mother-in-law widowed, and she goes out in the fields to glean. And the form of outdoor relief in the Old Testament laws, I'm sure you know, is that farmers shouldn't harvest to the edge of the field. In other words, they shouldn't maximize their profits, to leave things for the poor. I mean, that's embedded in the tradition. And austerity cut resources dramatically. I think Liverpool's council lost 50% of its budget. Austerity cut resources absolutely dramatically for those who were least able to cope with the cuts. And the trickle-down theory prevailed, and it doesn't work. It's just bad economics. Keynes knew that when he said that if you give more money to the richest, they will save it, or as he put it, hoard it, whereas the poor will spend it and regenerate the economy. The poor will spend it because they can't afford to save. So I think Ken Loach, in that extraordinary film, showed the indignities of austerity. I've been in food banks after food bank after food bank. I've been in debt counselling, and people, the worst part of it is the shame people feel. And that is the most appalling derangement of human dignity. I'll stop. I'm sorry, I'm getting into sermon mode there. He's gone to sleep.
Actually, I haven't gone to sleep. I muted myself, but I actually paused just to let your words sink in, actually. Because no, seriously, and then I noticed I was muted anyway, so I couldn't say any old nonsense. But yeah, and I mean, that takes us back to something I do know a little bit about, Tawny, and also the whole generation, the ragged trouser philanthropists and that, talking about the corruption of this is acquisitive society, and then Trestle talking about how the dignity of working people in these things. But I imagine both of them, I suspect, are influences on you.
Yes, I mean, the extraordinary thing about Tawny was he, Beveridge and Temple, I think they went to school together. They were certainly very close friends.
I think they all met on their first day at rugby, I think.
Oh, yeah. Was it there? Right.
I think so, yeah.
And
extraordinary.
Isn't that, I mean, can you imagine that down in Canterbury, there's, they wrote, Beveridge sat with Temple in York and down in Canterbury, working on the issues of the Beveridge Report and what that would lead to, inspired by Tawny and by Temple's own philosophical work. Just extraordinary coming together of incredible minds with a deep compassion.
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking of our poor old students at the moment. I mean, I made my best friends on my first day at university. None of us were in the class you were mentioning, but we're all still friends now. And I think just what at the moment is happening to poor old student life, who are not able to do that and are losing things that they can never get back. And I find that quite disturbing.
I agree. It's one of the tragedies at the moment. But I mean, I do think it's a challenge. It's very easy to blame people in government. I just want, it's easy to knock people in government. They've got the toughest job going. They spend their life making decisions that are completely impossible to get right. And the idea that they're sitting there conspiring, is on the whole, it's cock up rather than conspiracy. And so I'm quite, as I said earlier, I'm not very good at judging them, but I do think austerity was a very, very serious mistake. Fair
enough. And indeed, in what you've been saying now and what you write in the book, Peter Selby, I'm sure you know, in his review, he calls you courageous. And of course, in Yes Minister, courageous is the thing that reduces, whenever Sir Humphrey uses it, it reduces Hacker to a quivering wet, and he knows he's done wrong. But of course,
is it that bad? Sir Humphrey?
That's right. Yes, is it that's the line? Yeah, is it that bad? Now, of course, we have to reflect the fact that not everyone agrees with you. Your favourite journalist, Rod Liddle, who had a go at you this weekend, pretty unforgivably. Well, actually, most of it pretty unforgivable. But I did understand when he also reviewed your book. He didn't like it, but he did say things. Occasionally you have to listen. He said 1 part Jesus Christ, 4 parts was it Ernie Bevin, which I think he probably meant as respectful, but 5 parts a Guardian op-ed piece, which he didn't mean as a term of endearment. You're no stranger to criticism, and it's right that you should be. But how do you respond to the idea that, you are the left-wing prelate or whatever words they use?
I am, I certainly think Rowan was probably more left-wing than I. He's shifting the buck quickly. But, I mean, he described himself as a hairy lefty. I mean, look at whatever I am, I'm at least half of that is untrue. But I think the early part of my day, from when I get up, is spent in the Bible and in prayer. That is the anchor for my thinking. If I didn't find, you'll notice in the book, in Reimagining Britain, that I think virtually, perhaps not every chapter, but almost every chapter has as the core of the chapter a Bible story. It is trying to bring out the extraordinary power of the scriptures written between 2 and over 3,000 years ago to apply to a just society. That's what shapes me. It's absolutely not Marx. And I have read quite a lot of bits of Marx, yes. I studied political philosophy. It is deeply Christ and the prophets. And so no Guardian op-eds, thank you. 6 parts, 7 parts scripture, some reason, quite a bit of Keynes. I'll admit to Keynes. I find him a really inspiring thinker, and a lot of Temple.
Fair enough. Several people are commenting on what you've just been saying about austerity, but it'll just make you big-headed, which you're definitely not if I read them out. But a lot of agreement. Yes. So, and I think that is a good answer. And I think also the other thing to say is, I mean, you when we chatted earlier, you did intervene once in politics directly in the last general. Was it the last general election?
Yes.
Yes. But not in the way that people might have expected.
No, the chief rabbi published an article very critical of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party about 2 weeks before the vote, before polling day. So right at the height of the campaign. And it's always been a well understood convention that that the chief rabbi didn't say things, nor did the cardinal, nor did I. You know, we're a democracy. People vote as they should vote. But when he was kind enough to show me his piece before it was published, and I took a very deep breath and thought, to say nothing is to say something. And so I did support him quite strongly. Again, not personally attacking leaders of the Labour Party, Mr. Corbyn or other people, but I did back up the chief rabbi on that. And that was a clear intervention that could not but be interpreted politically. I didn't mention anything else apart from the issues around the fears that we were hearing from across the Jewish community. I was hearing from all sides, and it comes also from my deep-set historical belief, and I'm a historian before I'm anything else, my deep-set historical belief that anti-Semitism is the taproot of all hatred of minorities in European society. And it's Bonhoeffer, the great German theologian killed by Hitler, who said, to say nothing is to say something. And I just thought, I cannot say nothing. With great reluctance, I have to say, as was the chief rabbi's statement. From his point of view, he was agonizing over whether he should say it.
Well, I think you were both right, and also right to quote Bonhoeffer, perfect quote. And just on that last bit, really, just lighten the mood slightly, and then we're going to end, but then I'm going to ask something else of you. Back to Desert Island Disc, you take as your luxury the entire set of the West Wing, and of course the president in who's unfortunately fictional is a devout Catholic, a man of faith, and it's a constant plot line. I just want to say we had Alistair Campbell a few weeks ago, and of course he famously, he was lovely. He famously intervened when Tony Blair was about to do something on faith and said, "We don't do God." I'm sure you know that quote.
Oh yeah.
Do you think politicians should do God?
I think politicians should be free to do God. I think Tim Farron was both extremely brave and extremely abused when he did God. We believe in freedom of religion and belief. Politicians should be perfectly entitled to do God or not do God according to their own choice. and make that choice, which is one that God gives us, it seems to me. That's also a bit of Christian theology for what it's worth. And yes, everyone has a value system. People who don't do God are making a clear statement about what they believe or don't believe. They believe there's no God. They will also have a value system which they believe in and which guides their life, and it will very often be a very powerful and excellent value system. So yeah, I don't have a problem with politicians doing God or not doing God. I quite like them to be competent.
Fair enough. I have to say, I'm not a person of faith, but if I was going to be, it would be after talking to you. I can say that with my hand on heart. Now, listen, I'm going to do a couple of announcements, but don't go, because I want to end with something that I know is close to your heart. So first of all, everyone listening, Justin, your first book was called Dethroning Mammon. I said Mammon then, Mammon. But it's time for me to make a straight appeal to Mammon, because we need a bit of Mammon to keep the RSM going at the moment. So do please support this webinar, join the RSM as members, and do everything you can to keep the show on the road in this very difficult times. And then for our regulars, tomorrow lunchtime, 12:30, back to COVID. This time it's about allocating critical care and scarce resources in the pandemic. In other words, we're going to be talking about the R word, and this time it's not the rate, it's the rationing. Andrew Jack will be in the chair from the FT, Mammon's daily newspaper. And we'll have Tim Cook, intensive care, Misha Qureshi, and Jane Dacre, past president of the Royal College of Physicians, who's now chair of the MPS. So a great panel. That's tomorrow, 12:30. And this time next week, it'll be the Roger and Richard show. Roger Kirby will be talking to Richard Smith, editor of the BMJ. And someone has already asked this question. I promise you next week will be largely about climate change, which we have not got into today because we can't do everything. But come back next week and we'll be talking about climate change. Back to you, Justin. So you said a few days ago on Good Morning Britain, please don't go on Britain's Got Talent, by the way, that was a joke, but you do Good Morning Britain.
I haven't got it.
Okay, but you were talking about COVID, and you were talking about our politicians, which you were just raising then, and it's this issue. You called on them to confess their regrets to God, I think was the quote you used. And I want to ask you what you mean by confess, and then I want to go on to the issue of forgiveness and give you the last words there. So first of all, explain what you meant when you said to confess their, and you also use the word regrets, and you're obviously someone who chooses your words very carefully. What were you conveying?
What I was conveying is that self-awareness is essential to the handling of power. Self-suspicion, self-awareness, challenge. I'm very, very well looked after here. I have an absolutely amazing team of people who are really willing to challenge me and to tell me when I get things wrong. Every human being gets things wrong. The most dangerous thing is power combined with a belief in your that you never make a mistake. But as we know in the press, the moment the Prime Minister were to say, well, I think I got that wrong, he'd never be allowed to figure. The next question is always, so are you going to resign, Prime Minister? If not, why not? Because you got something wrong. And actually in West Wing at the last episode of Series 6, there's a very good example of that. And it might be the first one of Series 7. But so I would say, for me, confession to God of sin and regret and mistake and self-examination with God is essential to both security and to being aware and to having an open mind and learning to do better.
Okay, fair. But obviously, when one confesses, one also is asking for forgiveness, and that's the kind of theme of your ministry, and you've talked about it a lot during your tenure. Now, a lot of people, including quite a few people we've been talking to in this series and conversations about COVID, don't seem to be in a very forgiving mood. And people who've been following will remember several been very passionate about this. What would you say to people who feel that the things that have happened that can't be forgiven?
Well, I lecture myself about forgiveness, but I'm careful about how I lecture others. I've spent much of the since 2002, almost 20 years, working in areas of war, doing mediation stuff with militias, with other groups, with some really, really bad people.
Mm.
I've spent time with victims. I've stood by mass graves with literally thousands of corpses in the town where I was. And you don't just go in and lecture them about the need to forgive. Read the Psalms and you'll see the cursing of enemies, which comes from a visceral sense of hatred. But I've also been through myself, as you know, I mean, it's quite a public thing, that our first daughter died in a car crash.
Yes.
And there was responsibility on someone else. And I thought, until I met that person again many years later, that I'd forgiven. It's not that I hate them. It's just, it's a real struggle to encounter them. And so, again, you know, John's Gospel, chapter 8, the story of the woman caught in adultery, where Jesus says to her, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. But he says to the crowd that wants to lynch her, those of you without sin, throw the first stone. So I'm not going to start throwing stones. But if you don't have forgiveness, you must end up logically in a vendetta culture, where you are constantly trying to get your own back. Where would Europe be if there had been no forgiveness of the great crimes of the Nazi era? Forgiveness is not an emotion. Forgiveness is about the action of seeking to re-establish relationship, however feeble and however weak, amidst anger and horror. It's a plant that you have to plant and nurture in yourself, because otherwise the weeds of hatred will grow with immense strength, and they will throttle you, and they will throttle your life and those around you. Now, you'll have seen that in your profession. But forgiveness is not a simple thing. It's a process. It's not an event. It's something that is deeply painful and requires immense sacrifice. At the heart of the Christian faith is forgiveness, the forgiveness of human beings by God, requiring sacrifice, the crucifixion. And that cost, which is pictured so powerfully there in what wonderful German theologian called Moltmann called the crucified God, that is what opens the way for freedom for us to relate and grow. So yes, forgiveness does matter. It doesn't take away from blame. You know, someone said to me the other day, well, would you forgive a paedophile or would you send them to prison? And that's the wrong answer, the wrong question. Of course they go to prison. Justice demands that. And they will pay the cost of their crimes, as did many of the people, for instance, at Nuremberg. But do you, from there, allow, is it right, is it healthy for the society, having punished them, to encourage hatred? I worked over the last few years in a particular place of conflict where there is a vendetta culture. It goes from generation to generation. The consequences are positively, you know, life is nasty, brutish, and short. For exactly that reason. Forgiveness is a necessary part of our life, but it's a very costly part of our life. There's a wonderful book by a Croatian theologian called Miroslav Volf called Exclusion and Embrace, which deals with that when one of his own family had been murdered in the civil war there and the breakup of Yugoslavia. And one of the things there he says is Christ stands with the victim. That's we all say. But he goes on to say, and this is as a victim, he also stands with the perpetrator to offer them a way forward amidst their crimes and their guilt.
Thank you. Thank you. That's perfect.
Oh, and by the way, the FT is also my favourite paper.
Okay. Now then, I have to finish off now. So I had notes for a couple of things, and one of it says, if he doesn't mention temple, you're in trouble, but you did. So I went to the trouble of looking at what was said about him, and I want to end with George Bell, the Bishop of Chichester, who, as I'm sure you know, was absolutely no stranger to courage himself, and an extreme, very, very moral man. So this is what he wrote. He says, his obit. He said, William Temple was not only one of the greatest men of his day, but also one of the greatest teachers who've ever filled the Archbishop of Canterbury. His influence on the British people in the field of social justice, on the Christian church as a whole, and in international relations was of a kind to which it would be very difficult to find a parallel in modern England. Now, yes. If Bell was alive today, you won't like this, but if Bell was alive today, I think he would agree that there is a parallel in modern England. And to all our listeners, I hope you'll agree, we've been talking to him for the last hour in his company. That was fantastic, Justin. I hate the word, I never use it, but I will now. Actually, you are close to inspirational, and that was fantastic. No, honestly, I mean it. Thank you for sparing the time with us, and hopefully we will see you when times are easier, when we won't be hindered by the medium of Zoom. Not that you had any problem with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much, those who listened. I'm very grateful indeed.
So are we. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, all.
Good night.